Have you ever walked into a room and felt like you were interrupting something, even though no one noticed you came in, like you were both present and invisible? Like your very existence made the air a little colder, not because you were wrong, but because you were real. There's a name for that silence that follows you. But no one says it out loud. They just call you quiet. They just call you intense. But what they mean is, you make them uncomfortable without even trying. You were quiet before the world asked you to be. Not shy, not afraid, just observant. Long before they called it awkward, long before they labeled it too much or too intense. You were already listening deeper than anyone around you realized. And in that silence, something ancient stirred. You saw things, not the obvious, not the loud. You noticed the way someone's eyes shifted when they lied. The split-second pause before forced laughter. The hollowness behind "I'm fine." You weren't searching for truth. It found you anyway. In the cracks between words. In the glances that didn't match the tone. In the way people touched their phones more than each other. And so you stopped speaking. Not because you had nothing to say, but because you already knew no one wanted to hear what you'd say if you told the truth. They said you were safe, but what they meant was forgettable. They said you were calm, but what they meant was invisible. You were not overlooked because you were small. You were overlooked because you were real. And nothing terrifies people more than a presence that does not perform for approval. They crave noise to distract themselves from what your silence reveals. In rooms full of voices, your quiet became unsettling. Not because it was weak, but because it couldn't be controlled. You don't echo back what they want to hear. You don't play the game. You don't dilute your truth just to make others feel taller. And so, they shrink you, with smiles, with silence, with the kind of politeness that feels more like exile than acceptance. You've known this feeling for years. That sense of being there, but not really. Of watching people speak like they're reading from scripts while you're stuck wondering who wrote the lines in the first place. No one teaches you how to live in this gap. Between the way people pretend and the way you perceive. Between how loud they are and how much you see without saying a word. It's not loneliness. It's the ache of carrying depth in a world built for surfaces. And the truth is, you've tried. You've smiled when it hurt. You've lowered your voice. You've swallowed questions until your mind choked on silence. You've played the part, but every performance costs you something. And now, you're done. Done making yourself smaller for people who confuse gentleness with weakness. Done nodding to lies just to stay invited. Done begging for permission to feel what others are too numb to name. You were never meant to blend in. You were born to break the pattern by being the one thing no one can fake. Stillness. Let them laugh louder. Let them talk over each other. You'll keep walking with your hands in your pockets and your truth burning quietly behind your eyes. Because silence in the hands of someone awake becomes a weapon. Not to hurt, but to cut through illusion. And if they fear your presence now, it's only because they sense what you're no longer willing to hide. That you don't need to be heard to be dangerous. You didn't ask to see this much. You didn't beg to carry this kind of perception. But once you saw, you couldn't unsee. That was the curse. It didn't come with glory. It came quietly, like a crack in a mirror, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. You began to notice everything they pretended not to. The way people speak in loops, how conversations feel rehearsed, how truth is always one question too far. You stopped laughing when everyone else laughed. Not out of pride, but because your body refused to pretend. There's nothing noble about awareness. It doesn't make you happy. It doesn't make you powerful. It makes you ache. It makes you carry things you can't explain, like why you flinch at fake smiles, or why you feel more alone in a crowd than you ever did in your room. They call it overthinking. They call it being difficult. But they don't see what it costs to notice the things no one else wants to see. The contradictions, the subtle betrayals, the way the world rewards performance, not presence. So you begin to hold your thoughts back. You stop asking why out loud. Not because you've stopped wondering, but because you've learned the price of honesty. Every time you spoke truth into a room built on illusion, you could feel the room push back, not with logic, not with argument, but with withdrawal. They don't fight you, they vanish from you. And you learn. The more awake you are, the more asleep they want you to act. You learn to nod, to smirk, to make your voice a little softer, your questions less sharp. You wear masks not to lie, but to survive. You become a translation of yourself, edited, cropped, digestible. But each time you shrink for them, a part of you dies. A thought unspoken, a truth buried, a fire smothered by politeness. They don't see the funeral you carry in your silence. They see someone agreeable. And that's how awareness becomes exile. Not because you're above anyone, not because you wanted to stand apart, but because depth threatens the surface. And most of the world lives on surfaces. You didn't choose isolation. It came as a side effect, like smoke from the fire of your own mind. They never told you that knowing too much could be a prison. That insight without echo becomes torment. That when no one mirrors back your depth, you begin to doubt it was ever real to begin with. But it was. It still is. You don't suffer because you're broken. You suffer because you were never built for the performance. You were built for truth. And truth in its rawest form has never been fashionable. So if you feel distant, like you're watching life from behind glass, like everyone else is playing a role you never auditioned for, that's not a flaw. That's the curse. But it's also your origin. Because only the ones cast out by the false world are free to build a real one. They said they wanted thinkers, but what they meant was agreeable minds with good timing. They said they admired intelligence, but only the kind that doesn't make them uncomfortable. You learned this the hard way, not through debate, but through distance. Not through arguments, but through absence. People didn't fight your truth. They disappeared from it. Not because it was wrong, but because it made their comfort unravel. Society is a delicate illusion, a theater built on unspoken contracts. Keep things light, stay within the script, and above all, never question the foundation the whole play rests on. But you saw the cracks. You heard the lines repeated one too many times, and you asked the question that no one was prepared to answer. What if none of this is real? And that's when they turned on you. Not loudly, not cruelly, but quietly, the way a room grows cold when you've said too much. It's not logic that gets rejected, it's clarity. Because clarity doesn't flatter, it cuts. Clarity doesn't entertain, it exposes. You didn't get sidelined because you failed. You got sidelined because you refused to pretend. And the world is addicted to pretending. It's easier to label you intense than admit they've built their lives on autopilot. Easier to say you don't fit in than admit the system was never designed for people who see through it. You don't question just rules. You question meaning. You question authority. You question the rituals people perform just to feel safe, even when those rituals are slowly suffocating them. That's the real crime. You disturb their sleep. You weren't exiled for being wrong. You were exiled for being awake. Think about it. How often have you felt punished just for telling the truth too early? How many times have you been told you were too negative when all you did was point to a wound they were pretending not to feel? It's not that they don't see what you see. It's that they can't afford to see it yet. Truth is expensive. It costs comfort. It costs belonging. It costs identity. And most people will choose a beautiful lie over a brutal truth every single time. So what does society really want? Consensus, not curiosity. Agreement, not insight. Harmony, even if it's built on denial. They will celebrate thinkers, as long as they don't think too loud. They will quote visionaries, as long as the vision doesn't include them. And they will claim to value authenticity, as long as it doesn't ask them to change. So you learned, not to lie, but to go quiet. To let the illusion breathe. To let people hold on to their comfort, even if it means suffocating your truth. But silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. You are not weak for being misunderstood. You're dangerous because you still see clearly in a world that's gone blind on purpose. And one day they'll say you came out of nowhere. But the truth is, you've been here the whole time, quiet, watching, waiting. Let them stay asleep. You've already outgrown their dream. There was a time you tried to laugh at the jokes that didn't land, tried to care about the things that numbed you, tried to mold your tone, your pace, your face into something that wouldn't scare people off. You thought maybe if I just soften a little, they'll stay. But they didn't stay, and worse, neither did you. Piece by piece, you disappeared. Every time you bit your tongue, a thought died inside you. Every time you agreed just to keep peace, a boundary dissolved. And every time you silenced yourself to stay close, you ended up lonelier than if you'd spoken and walked away. That's the cruel paradox. To belong, you had to vanish. You were accepted, but as a version of you that didn't exist. They liked your smile, not the thoughts behind it. They liked your presence as long as it didn't cast a shadow on their illusions. And for a while, you let it happen, because being alone scared you more than being edited. But slowly, quietly, your body began to revolt. You stopped feeling rested in rooms full of people. You stopped feeling safe in conversations where your truth had to hide. Your chest got tighter, your smile more brittle, your thoughts heavier. That wasn't depression, that was dissonance. You weren't failing to connect. You were refusing to betray yourself, and your body felt the cost of compromise. You watched yourself shrink just to be held. You dulled your edges to avoid being called difficult. You made yourself easy to like and impossible to love. Because how can anyone truly love you when you've buried what makes you real? This is how belonging dies. Not with rejection, but with imitation. Not with exile, but with applause for a mask. The death of belonging is not loud. It's slow. It's subtle. It's in every moment you ignore the whisper in your chest just to hear a cheer from the outside. But the whisper never leaves. It waits, like a fire under ash, like a name you haven't said in years. And one day, it speaks louder than the applause. That's when everything shifts. Not because you become angry, but because you become unwilling. Unwilling to trade your voice for validation. Unwilling to keep dressing wounds with compliments. Unwilling to abandon your truth just to earn a seat at a table built on pretending. You realize you were never rejected. You were misplaced. And now you choose not to belong to anything that requires your silence as payment. Not because you hate them, but because you've finally remembered what it costs to forget yourself. You stopped explaining, not because you stopped caring, but because you saw what explaining became a slow erosion of your presence. Every time you unraveled your thoughts, just to make them easier to swallow, you carved away your edge, your stillness, your power. And so you chose silence. Not the silence of surrender, the silence of arrival. You walk into rooms now with nothing to prove. And that unsettles people more than any sermon. Because most are used to noise. They mistake loudness for certainty. They trust people who talk fast, smile big, say what's expected. But you speak like someone who listens to thunder. You move like you've been somewhere darker than here. You hold eye contact the way most people hold back truth with gravity. You no longer need to dominate the room. You are the room. The space shifts when you enter. The tempo softens. The air recalibrates. You don't ask for attention. You dismantle the need for it. Because presence isn't volume, it's weight. It's the kind of gravity that builds in people who've bled quietly for years and came out the other side with something colder than rage clarity. People feel it in your pauses, in your lack of urgency to respond, in the way you don't reach for approval even when it's being offered. You used to fill silences to keep others comfortable. Now you let silence stretch like a canvas, not an absence. You don't chase being understood anymore. You speak truth that doesn't care if it's received. Because truth, when it's real, doesn't beg to be believed. You stopped adjusting your rhythm for people who were never listening anyway. And suddenly, your presence became undeniable. Not because it's loud, but because it's rooted. You've touched too much reality to fake lightness now. And that groundedness, that unapologetic existence, that's what makes people tremble. Because it reminds them of what they buried to belong. You no longer perform the version of you that makes others feel taller. You no longer answer questions meant to shrink your soul into a category. You stand. That's it. No preamble, no apology, no need to soften the edges they haven't earned the right to touch. You are no longer available for explanation. You are not a concept to be decoded. You are not an open tab waiting for understanding. You are the presence they don't know how to label, but can no longer ignore. Let them get it wrong. Let them say you're distant, cold, arrogant, detached. They need that illusion. It protects them from what you actually are, a mirror. Not the flattering kind, the kind that reflects what they've spent years avoiding. People don't fear you because you're mysterious. They fear you because you make them feel seen in ways they haven't consented to. So they reduce you to labels, to guesses, to assumptions wrapped in ego. And for a long time, you tried to correct them. You thought if I just explain it right, they'll understand. They'll see I'm not trying to hurt them. They'll know I'm not above them. But they never heard your words. They only heard their fear. They weren't listening to understand. They were listening to defend the version of reality your existence threatened to break. You became too much, not because you overstepped, but because you refused to shrink. And in a world built on smallness, refusal to shrink is rebellion. That's why they misunderstood you. Not by accident, but by necessity. Because if they really saw you, saw the sharpness in your stillness, the depth behind your gaze, the clarity in your silence, they'd have to question everything they thought was true. They'd have to meet their own reflection, and most people aren't ready for that. So they misunderstand you instead. And in doing so, they give you a gift. They leave you alone. And in that aloneness, you find your shape again. You stop bending. You stop trimming truth for comfort. You stop asking to be seen through lenses that were never built to hold your light. You start speaking in your own language, even if no one else understands. You start walking with a kind of pace that doesn't match the world's urgency, but matches your soul's rhythm. You let yourself be misunderstood, and in doing so, you stop betraying yourself for clarity that was never coming. You find peace in the distortion. Because you realize the deeper you go, the less visible you become. But also the more unshakable you are. You become weathered, like stone shaped by time, still standing even when the world has forgotten how to read your texture. You are no longer waiting to be decoded. You are no longer softening your edge so that others don't cut themselves on your truth. You are misunderstood, and that is your strength. Because only the truly awake can endure being seen as a stranger in the very world they see so clearly. They told you solitude was failure. That if no one sits beside you, you must have done something wrong. That if your phone is quiet, your worth must be fading. They told you to chase connection like oxygen, as if the absence of noise meant the absence of life. But they were wrong. You didn't lose people. You lost noise. And in the quiet that followed, you found something louder than any conversation yourself. Solitude doesn't scream. It hums, like a frequency only the honest can hear. And at first, you resisted it. You filled the silence with distractions, checked your phone, scrolled endlessly, tried to outrun the stillness like it was chasing you. But eventually, you stopped. Not because you gave up, but because you realized you were never being hunted. You were being invited. Invited to return to what's real, to peel away the layers you wore for approval, to sit with the version of you that didn't need to perform. And that version, the one who breathes slower, thinks deeper, hurts quieter, is not weak. It's sovereign, because in solitude there's no one left to impress, no stage, no spotlight, no echo of forced laughter. Just presence, raw and unrushed. And that's where you discovered something rare. The power of not being needed. The strength of not being watched. The clarity that comes when no one's interrupting your truth with their expectations. You stopped asking, "Why am I alone?" and started asking, "What have I been missing while trying not to be?" You stopped measuring time by conversation and started measuring it by stillness. You realized your best thoughts came when no one was listening. Your deepest breaths happened when no one was watching. Your truest self emerged when no one was managing your mirror. This wasn't isolation. This was reclamation. You weren't pushed away, you were pulled inward. And now, solitude is not a lack of options. It is a choice, a boundary, a throne without an audience. You walk alone not because you're unworthy of company, but because your soul no longer begs for fragments when it has found its whole. Let them think you're lonely. Let them assume you're missing out. They don't see what you see from here, how clear the sky gets when you're above the noise. You weren't always like this. There was a time you didn't hold back, didn't scan rooms before you spoke, didn't dilute your thoughts just to fit. You were clear, untamed, present. But the world taught you something. It taught you that visibility comes with a cost. That truth, when unfiltered, invites exile. That honesty, when not convenient, is called a threat. So you adjusted. You learned to shape your voice to the shape of the room, to speak just enough to be liked, but never enough to be real. You forgot the sound of your own thoughts when they weren't being pre-approved. You forgot what silence felt like when it wasn't stuffed with apology. You forgot what it meant to be powerful without permission. But that forgetting, that's where most people stay. That's where the herd gathers in roles, in routines and rituals that were never theirs to begin with. But not you. Somewhere in the quiet you remembered. Not all at once, not in fireworks, but slowly, like a voice returning from a long exile. You remembered who you were before you became someone others could digest. Before you learned to translate your soul into something less frightening. And with that remembering came something else, power. Not the kind that seeks attention, not the kind that plays games or wins crowds. The kind that makes people pause when you walk into a room and they don't know why. The kind that doesn't need a spotlight because it brings its own gravity. This is the power they don't teach. The power they forget on purpose. Because a person who remembers who they are cannot be controlled. A person rooted in self doesn't chase belonging, they redefine it. You no longer knock on doors you were never meant to walk through. You no longer ask, will they like me if I show up like this? You ask, do I even want to be there? Do I even? That shift, it's everything. Because once you stop seeking permission, you become untouchable. Let them say you've changed. Let them call you distant, difficult, dangerous. They don't realize this is who you were before you learned to be small. This is not reinvention, it's resurrection. You are not here to entertain, not here to be chosen, not here to soften your edge so someone else can feel taller. You are here to remember, to reclaim, to walk differently because you see differently. And now that you've remembered, no one can take that from you again. They can misunderstand you, exclude you, call you names that don't fit. But they can't erase what you know now. That your silence was never emptiness. It was clarity waiting for space. And you were never broken, you were just buried. Now, you've returned. Not louder, not meaner, just real. And that is enough.